Always. I'm Scipio, the Shepherd Historian, and today we'll be discussing Peter the Great. A titan in Russian history, speaking both figuratively and descriptively, Peter Alexeyevich Romanov, the first emperor and autocrat of all the Russias, towered 6'8". He was one of the tallest men in Europe during his time. An Italian visitor to the Russian court, Filippo Baltari, described the man as such. Quote, Tsar Peter Alexeyevich was of great height, more thin than fat. He had thick, short, dark, chestnut hair and big black eyes with long eyelashes. His mouth was well formed, except for his lower lip. His face was handsome, inspiring respect at first glance. Given his great height, his legs seemed to me to be very thin. His head often jerked convulsively to the right. Unquote. Peter the Great lived an adventurous life. Considered by many Westerners at the time as an unruly barbarian, his Russian contemporaries as an enlightened despot, and by all, a very controversial figure for the destiny of Russia. But first, we must start our journey from the beginning. Born June 9, 1672, in Moscow, Russia, Peter grew up in a turbulent environment. After the death of his half-brother Tsar Fyodor III, a dispute erupted between the two major rival families at the court, the Narishkins and the Miloslavskis. This eventually led to a coup d'etat by the Streltsy, Moscow's elite musketeers. Headed by Sofina Alexeyevna, a daughter of Alexis I, the Streltsy murdered family and friends of Peter and were successful in establishing a co-czarship between Peter and his half-brother, Ivan V. However, much of the ruling was done by Sofia, and this left Peter to his own devices in Preobrazhenskoye, just north of Moscow. Near Preobrazhenskoye was the foreign quarter, Nemetskaya Sloboda, the German colony, where Peter would be enamored by Westerners and spark his lifelong obsession with Western European culture. Befriending several of the inhabitants of the foreign quarter, including the experienced Scottish general Patrick Gordon, Peter soon learned the crafts of Western shipbuilding, which implanted his lifelong passion for sailing. He would also create a mock army and, with the help of his new drill master Gordon, would engage in battles with his friends. When Peter turned 17, he decided he wanted to rule Russia without the tyrannical meddling of Sofia. So, in 1689, with the help of his newly created unit from Germantown, Peter convinced the Streltsy to recognize Peter as the true power behind the crown, and sentence Sofia to a convent for the rest of her life, thus exacting justice for her misdeeds towards Peter. Peter would still officially be co-czar until Ivan V's death in 1696. When Peter took power, his passion for the sea made him long to extend Russia's landlocked borders to a coast. Russia's only coastline was in the far north, with its port city Archangel being icebound most of the year. Traditionally, Czars had set their sights on the wealthy Baltic regions. However, Peter saw potential to the far south of Russia, to the Black Sea. At the time, the Black Sea was under the control of a major world power, the Ottoman Empire. Peter's prize would be the sea fortress of Azov. In the summer of 1695, Peter began his Azov campaign by marching his army and besieging the fortress. All attempts to take the Ottoman fortress ended in failure. Undeterred by this, Peter saw an opportunity and built the first official Russian fleet of 30 ships in Moscow, sailed down the Don and Varenza rivers, besieged and took Azov Fortress in 1696. Peter would found Russia's first navy in 1698 at the port of Taganrog, near Azov. Now, having firmly established himself in Moscow and eliminating any impending power plays at his court, Peter would embark upon the Grand Embassy. A trip to the major cities of Europe, the Grand Embassy was officially a diplomatic mission to gather allies for the Holy League of Christian nations to battle the Islamic Ottoman Empire. However, Peter's real intention was to learn during his time in the West what made the West the best. He realized Russia's backwardness and perceived Oriental barbarity to gentle Western visitors and was determined to drag Russia from the sublime Middle Ages to modernity. However, the Orthodox Church was not happy with Peter's unorthodox attitude and discouraged him from leaving the country, as Czars had very little left Russia outside of wartime campaigning. Peter ignored the Orthodox priests and set off to the west with his grand embassy. The Orthodox Church and traditional nobility in Russia were beginning to get frustrated with their unorthodox Tsar, but worse was yet to come. In 1697, Peter the Great set off with Russia's best diplomats and his own entourage on the grand embassy with himself as its head, mostly traveling incognito, having one of his court taking the disguise as the Tsar, as Peter wanted to see how Western societies functioned from the ground up, how things were built and broken, and he didn't much care for the pros and prompt of court. These are the characteristics that came from his childhood, having a hatred for the traditional court life, for that was the side of Russia that had taken everything away from him, and it was at Germantown that he created a new life for himself. So too here on the Grand Embassy he would learn from the builders themselves. He would establish diplomatic alliances in Courland and the German kingdom of Prussia, and would then travel to the Dutch Netherlands. Here he would be in disguise as a shipbuilder and for several months work in the shipbuilding town of Zaandam, near Amsterdam. He would also travel to England, meet with William III, ruler of both England and the Netherlands, and would even attend a session at Parliament. During his time in the major cultural centers of Europe, Peter would end up hiring specialists to bring back to his own country to better help westernize its industrial and cultural techniques. It was in Vienna that Peter was negotiating a failed alliance with Austria, and a Venetian diplomat he had gotten news that the Streltsy had been causing trouble in Moscow once more. He had to cancel his trip to the serene city of Venice and deal with the Streltsy. He was absolutely furious, and he would deal with this problem once and for all, harshly. On the way back to Russia, Peter and his embassy traveled to Poland, where he met the Polish king Augustus II, the Strong, and made a plan to go to war with Sweden, which will become more relevant later. Once back in Moscow, Peter dealt with the Streltsy brutally. The Streltsy were put to the axe, sometimes by Peter's own hand. Any of the Streltsy were hanged in major centers of the capital as a sign to those who may oppose the great Tsar Peter. The Streltsy, the ones that caused Peter so much dread as a child, were now crushed under his boot, and Peter now set his sights on a new prize, the Baltic, which was controlled by the Swedish Empire. By 1700, the Great Northern War had broke out between the Swedish Empire, Russia, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and Denmark. The war would last 21 years and would decide the fate of both Russia and Northern Europe's future. At the time, Charles XII was the King of Sweden and was very young, being only 15 when he ascended to the Swedish throne in 1697. Peter felt that this would weaken Sweden and saw the Great Northern War as an opportunity for Russia to conquer Sweden's long-desired Baltic Sea coast. However, Peter did not expect that King Charles would be a military genius, and in November 1700, the Battle of Narva commenced. A besieging Russian force was attacked and routed by the Swedish forces. Having left before the battle to discuss plans with the Polish King Augustus, Peter returned to find his army in tatters. Charles would see that the Russians were in no way a threat to him and continued his war with his more powerful enemies being the Polish Commonwealth and Denmark. He then marched his army down into Poland. Meanwhile, Peter began rebuilding his own army back home in Russia, enforcing conscription to create a massive army, one that could eventually be trained to take down the Swedes. While Charles was battling the Poles in Poland, Peter founded the new Russian port city of St. Petersburg in 1703 on the coast of Ingermanland. Officially named after his patron saint, many have suspected that Peter named the city after himself, due to his egomaniacal nature and love of secularism. It should also be noted that Peter was surrounded by Masonic forces brought into Russia through the foreign officers such as Franz Lefort, Jacob Bruce, and Patrick Gordon, and many have suspected Peter of being a Mason himself. Many Russian peasants and prisoners of war would be sacrificed in the building of Peter's floating city in the cold and disease-ridden swamp of Ingermanland. This would mark the beginning of Russia's struggle with her identity of being a Western nation, an Orthodox nation, or somewhere in between, but that is a discussion for another time. Back to the war, Charles had defeated his enemies in the West, forcing the Polish king to abdicate and now focused on Russia. Charles defeated Peter at the Battle of Golovchin, but would face his first defeat by Peter at the Battle of Riga. Instead of retreating back into Poland, Charles decided to face the Russians head-on by invading the Ukraine. Like many armies during the 18th and 19th centuries, the Swedish army supplied itself not only from supply trains and trade routes, but also by raiding, looting, and living off the land. However, Peter would create a staple in many Russian wars to come, which was scorched earth policy. The Russians burned farms and wheat fields, giving an already supply-stretched Swedish army little food to forage. With low food, ammunition, and thinning morale, Charles decided to do battle on June 27, 1709, which was the Battle of Poltava. At the Battle of Poltava, the Swedish army, which consisted of 30,000 men, battled the 75,000 Russian forces. However, a Russian sniper shot Charles in the foot, crippling him from riding horse and sufficiently commanding his forces in battle. In what is considered one of the great battles of history, Peter and the Russian army decisively defeated the Swedes and routed them. Charles would seek refuge in the Ottoman Empire, rather than being captured by the Russians. And the Nystad Treaty between Russia and Sweden would cede Ingria, Estonia, Livonia, and a large portion of Karelia, which ended the Swedish Empire and began the Russian Empire. Peter morphed the Tsardom into the Empire, and on November 2nd, 1721, was crowned Emperor of all the Russias. In Russia, Peter made sweeping reforms, forcing Russia to adopt the culture and techniques of the West. He commissioned the Danish cartographer and explorer Vitus Bering to explore Russia's far eastern coast and explore what is today the explorer's namesake, the Bering Sea. He forced the nobility to shave their beards, which angered all of Russian society. Many Russians believed their beards to have spiritual value, and many who did cut their beards kept them and requested that their beards be buried with them, so they may go to heaven. Only the priests were spared the cutting of the beards, and all those who refused to cut their beards were required to pay a beard tax and given a token to have permission to have a beard. These nobles were also required to adopt Western dress and manners. Peter also moved his capital to St. Petersburg, which was the final straw. Many nobles and Orthodox hierarchy looked to Peter's son, Prince Alexis, to return Russia back to her old traditions. However, having disappointed his father and hating his reforms, young Alexis, with his mistress, fled Russia to the Austrian court, where Peter got word that Alexis was trying to raise an Austrian army against his father. Seeing the young Alexis as incompetent, the Austrians rejected Alexis, who then fled to Naples in southern Italy. Disgraced by his son, the aging Peter sent his emissary to Naples to convince his son to return to Russia on the promise of no repercussion. Alexis did return, but was accused of conspiracy, and in his characteristic rage, had his son tortured and killed in the dark dungeons of Russia. Peter would die in 1725, aged 52, leaving no viable heir to the throne, which was handed over control to his mistress Catherine, a war consort from the Baltic. A controversial figure, Peter the Great was a transformative figure in Russian history, a heavy drinker and suspected Satanist. Peter would westernize Russia against her own will. Was Peter necessary to Russia? Should have Russia westernized, opening her up to more dangerous ideas from the West? It's hard to say. There are certainly despicable things about Peter's character, especially his treatment of peasants and his disrespect to Orthodox Christianity in Russia. But Peter also modernized Russia's army and made Russia a respectable member of the family of nations in Europe. What's your take on Peter the Great? Was he an evil despot or an enlightened Renaissance warrior king? I would like to see what discussions will be in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe if you'd like to see more from me. This has been the Shepherd Historian, Valet.